Welcome. Welcome to today's forum. The topic of the Milbank Tweed Forum today is Boundaries of the Law, Perspectives on the Refugee Crisis. Now, this is a topic that many of you will be familiar with, at least from watching TV regularly. There are disasters relating to refugees occur regularly and create headlines. And our role here, what we want to do, is to provide a little bit of a deeper contextual understanding of what is going on, how legal rules structure what is going on, and possibly at which directions actions might go to try to address these challenges better. In order to do that, we have on the panel three panelists. We have to my left Turku Işıksel, who is going to focus on the Turkish European side of things. Then we have to my left Piet Eckhout, currently an Emil Noel Fellow here, who will discuss the European political process. And to my right is Adam Cox, who will provide a comparative American perspective on what is going on. But before I hand over the floor to Turku, I just want to begin by putting the crisis in context by emphasizing two important points. First of all, there are something like 45 to 50 million refugees in the world. And the great majority of those refugees, more than 85%, end up in neighboring countries where they're fleeing from, typically developing countries. So the refugee problem, to a great extent, is not a rich country's problem. It's primarily a poor country's problem. Very concretely, if we look at the refugee crisis as it perhaps dramatically unfolds in the context of Syria, where we have a country of 22 million, approximately 4 to 6 million are internally displaced in Syria, and 4 million have fled it. There are 4 million refugees coming from Syria. Of those 4 million refugees, more than 3.5 million find themselves in the countries directly surrounding Syria. They are in Turkey, in Lebanon, or in Jordania. Only approximately 400,000 of those 4 million, that's 10%, have made their way to Europe and have created the European aspect of the refugee crisis. So this puts the crisis into a perspective. Furthermore, more generally, if you look at the 10 top countries the top countries as far as receiving refugees are concerned, of those top 10 countries, except for Germany, which comes in there at 8 or 9, not a single country is a Western or a rich country. So this is not primarily a Western problem. We shouldn't think of it that way. But nonetheless, there is a dimension there that we will here want to probably spend a bit of time focusing on. And secondly, we should not confuse the refugee problem with the wider problem of migration. So if you seek recognition as a refugee, you have to claim that you are politically persecuted for a certain set of reasons. That's very different from persons who seek to immigrate somewhere because of the economic opportunities provided elsewhere. Now, that too is a perfectly valid reason to go from one country to another, but the legal regime governing that is completely different. So migration is an issue, immigration based on economic opportunity, where basically states, I'm simplifying just a little bit, but not much, it's up to states whom they admit and who they don't admit for immigration purposes. But when it comes to recognizing refugees, there are international legal norms that require states to accept refugees under certain circumstances. So that, I think, as an introductory remark, must suffice. We'll be getting into the details as we go on. But understanding that this is not primarily a first world problem, and understanding that this is not about migration generally, but about a distinctive problem relating to political persecution, violence, etc., that people are fleeing from, is important to get straight right at the beginning. So to begin, we go from left to right. So we start off with Turku.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to, as Professor Koum said, I'm going to focus mostly on the sort of Turkey dimension of the refugee crisis and focus in particular on the situation of Syrian refugees. So as some of you may be aware, there was an EU Council summit last week, and migrants and refugees were at the top of the agenda. And in August, you may recall that Chancellor Merkel described the crisis as the biggest crisis facing the EU, more important or perhaps more lasting than even the Euro crisis. And part of this summit was an agreement that was under negotiation last week with Turkey, on which Turkey and the EU have now reached consensus. It's called the Refugee Action Plan, which has 3 stated aims. So I want to highlight the aims of this action plan and comment a little bit on the politics behind it. The first stated aim of the action plan between the EU and Turkey is supporting Syrians who are under temporary protection in Turkey, making it easier for Turkey to provide assistance to these refugees and providing reportedly 3.4 billion euros in funding for, in part, to be used assisting reception centers for refugees in Turkey. Turkey is currently hosting 2.2 million Syrian refugees. That's the estimate. Another large number is that Turkey is spending about $4 billion on Syrian refugees per year. There are about 26 camps in the southeast of the country. I should also mention that there are a roughly equal number, so around 2 million refugees from Syria, in Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. 1.1 million in Lebanon alone, and if you consider that Lebanon's population is only about 4.5 million, that's a really sort of considerable number. So while the number of refugees that Turkey is hosting is large, in Turkey's population being close to 80 million, it's not as big of a proportion, and Turkey is doing its best to confine Syrian refugees to the camps that are being administered in the southeast of the country. So by contrast, the UNHCR reports the total number of Syrian asylum applications in Europe between 2011 to September of 2015 as roughly 500,000, though Germany alone expects that number to reach 1 million by the end of this year. So the action plan negotiated between the EU and Turkey is, under this plan, Turkey is expected to ensure that migrants are registered and documented, that they have access to basic needs, and that they are allowed participation in the economy, which is unlikely. So there's an important difference in the way that refugees are received and treated in Turkey and EU member countries like Germany or Austria or Sweden. In Turkey, refugees don't have job prospects, very limited access to health care, very limited access to education. There's no pretense that they will strike roots in Turkey and become citizens somewhere along the line. Turkey expects to be able to send them right back across the border once hostilities cease. This is a marked difference in terms of policy expectations between Turkey and EU member states, which realistically expect that some of these refugees will end up staying and will integrate into their societies in the medium to long term. In fact, Turkey has been doing some legal maneuvering to preclude these refugees' claims under the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. Although Turkey is a signatory, since 1968 it's maintained a so-called geographical limitation, meaning that it grants official refugee status under the convention only to citizens of Council of Europe countries. So yes, you heard right. Europeans get to claim refugee status in Turkey, but people from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and so on don't. They are eligible for temporary protection status. This is something that Turkey does in order to avoid giving full recognition to their rights under the Geneva Convention. So the refugees who seek asylum in Turkey tend to come from Syria, obviously, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Somalia, and they are not officially considered to be refugees. And Turkey's gambit in doing this is to be able to send these people on to other countries that are willing to grant them refugee status, hence the temporary protection status. So Europe is, unsurprisingly, a draw for refugees, and Turkey is seen as a temporary way station, unsurprisingly, because while they're allowed to survive in Turkey free from armed conflict, they're not allowed to do much more than that. So just by way of some statistics, over half of Syrian refugees in Turkey are under 18 years of age. About 550,000 of them are under the age of 4. About 150,000 of them were born in Turkey, but obviously don't have any citizenship prospects. And 600,000 children have been deprived of education for up to 4 years. The municipalities where these camps tend to be located are among the poorest and most resource-deprived in Turkey and the least stable in terms of security because of the ongoing conflict between the Turkish military and Kurdish militants in that region. And in addition, Kurds and Arabs face racism in Turkish society as a whole. Okay. So the second priority on the agenda of the action plan between the EU and Turkey is to strengthen cooperation to prevent irregular migration flows into EU member states. So one item here is to stop smuggling. The EU is concerned, rightly, that Turkish authorities have been turning a blind eye to sophisticated people smuggling operations. The Turkish government so far has been refraining from obstructing their operations, again, because it has an interest in seeing these large flows of people move out of the country and seek livelihoods elsewhere. So last month, you may have seen that the New York Times ran a very detailed feature about how there is a whole industry of selling the accoutrements of people smuggling in coastal cities in Turkey's west, selling life jackets in the shop windows and inflatable rafts and so on. So the EU, under the action plan, will help the Turkish Coast Guard with patrolling operations and provide additional funding. In addition, really importantly, part of the reason why the EU was so willing to pony up and give such a large chunk of money to Turkey was because Turkey pledges to readmit migrants who are found not to be eligible for refugee status, right? Those who are considered quote-unquote economic migrants. If they have come through Turkey, Turkey agrees to readmit them. Unclear what Turkey plans to do with these people. So finally, the action plan says that there's a willingness to address, quote unquote, the root causes leading to the massive influx of Syrians. And here, there's really not much to the action plan other than this sort of pledge. The EU seems to be showing a colossal failure here to appreciate the geopolitical dimension of the refugee crisis, or it's cognizant of these dynamics, but it underestimates its own ability to do anything about it other than throwing a lot of money at it. So Turkey is receiving refugees and deserves credit for that, but its reckless Syria policy has also contributed to creating large numbers of those refugees. So Turkey came under a lot of criticism for allowing a siege by the so-called Islamic State of the northern Syrian Kurdish town of Kobani in the past year. Kobani was a large population center. It's been laid to waste, and the ISIL siege and the back and forth has led to the displacement of around 300,000 people, and Turkey bears its share of the responsibility for this destruction and displacement because it's been bombing the Kurdish forces that are trying to defend this city, and it's been undercutting the ability of the Kurdish forces to maintain peace and order in northern Syria, where internally displaced Syrians, as well as residents of those areas, can find refuge so that they will not need to leave those areas. So a couple of final points. This 3.4 billion euro in assistance seems to legitimize and renew international respectability of a very corrupt and autocratic regime that's been ruling Turkey. The EU seems to be under the illusion that it's dealing with a partner state, the same state that it admitted to candidacy for membership in 2002, but things on the ground, with regard to the Turkish regime have changed so dramatically since then that this assumption no longer seems warranted. So one thing to watch out for is to see if the EU can control the money that it's pledged to Turkey. Cash funneled to this regime is a way of ending up in the shoeboxes in the houses of ministers and political surrogates. So we'll see how the EU plans to, what sorts of accountability mechanisms the EU can put into place. The EU has also delayed the release of the annual progress report that the European Commission is scheduled to issue right around now, right around last week, actually, in terms of Turkey's candidacy, the progress of its candidacy towards membership. And now that report will not be released until after elections take place in Turkey on November 1st. The Financial Times this week quoted an unnamed EU ambassador as saying that the report had been delayed, quote unquote, at the whim of the Sultan, end of quote. And finally, another concession that Turkey's extracted from the EU in exchange for readmitting migrants and cracking down on smuggling is that the EU is preparing to include Turkey in its list of safe countries, which will make it more difficult for citizens of Turkey to claim asylum in EU member states. Even as the AKP regime persecutes opponents, journalists, activists, and steps up ethnic violence against Kurds in Turkey. So in 2014, 23% of asylum requests by citizens of Turkey were considered well-founded by EU member states. Have human rights conditions in Turkey improved to such an extent since 2014 as to warrant Turkey's being listed as a safe country? I don't think so.
Excellent, Pete.
Thank you. We have all seen on our screens the unfolding European refugee crisis this summer and the EU's failure to offer a coherent response. Another EU default in the same summer as we've seen the Greek debt crisis. Most observers will agree that both crises are not just of the EU's own making, but that does not erase the fact that the policy responses appear wholly inadequate. My comments are just in three parts. First, how have we gotten ourselves into this mess in the EU? Second, what kind of policy response would be needed to deal with the crisis more effectively? And third, some comments on how critical I think all of this is to the EU's very ethos and the values on which it is based. First, the causes. We must start, of course, by recognizing that this is an extraordinary crisis in terms of the numbers of refugees pouring through borders, at least from a European perspective, and I fully take Mattia's comment that there are many more refugees outside Europe than in Europe, but definitely from a European perspective, we have not seen these kinds of numbers, I think, since World War II. But it's also clear that Europe's response has been defective and dysfunctional, more so than could be justified on the basis of the sheer numbers. And the reason, I think, is Schengen, the free movement zone established by the European Union in the 1990s, which encompasses most, not all EU countries, not the United Kingdom, and in fact also some non-EU countries like Switzerland. Schengen means free travel across intra-EU borders, like you can travel freely between states of the United States. But it has serious birth defects from which it is still suffering. If I can use an analogy, when the EU became serious about having a real single market with free movement of goods and services, it realized that it also had to become serious with having a single trade policy with the rest of the world. On a single market, goods can circulate freely, which cannot work if different states have different trade policies. Now, I'm of course not suggesting that the movement of people is like the trade in a commodity, but there is a similar problem with establishing a zone for free movement of persons. You basically need a common immigration policy, and you need it particularly as regards asylum seekers, because these are the people who are looking to reach certain countries in which they would like to have their asylum claim looked at. But the EU, which is the EU states, the EU member states, never intended to really have this common policy on immigration or asylum. They thought things could work by adopting some harmonizing legislation about who is entitled to refugee status, about reception conditions for asylum seekers, and most importantly, about which state is responsible for a particular asylum claim. The infamous Dublin regulation, which has as its central rule that it is the state in which the asylum seeker first entered the EU which is responsible for dealing with his or her claim. So that regulation, of course, now puts all of the burden on the southern and eastern European states. In fact, it has its origins in when Schengen was set up, and these southern and eastern European states were not part of it yet, and was kind of a strategy by France and Germany to avoid that all of the asylum claimants would reach them. We see a different world today, I think. So it's a system which clearly has not worked at all, but anything to do with immigration is now so toxic in most European countries politically that it's proving very difficult to change the system. And it's not only in the EU that immigration is toxic, I think. Second, what kind of policy response would be needed? For me, the refugee crisis is a very sobering lesson for my profession, the EU lawyers. There's a really nice apparatus of EU legislation harmonizing national laws on asylum and the treatment of asylum seekers. There are clear rules in the Dublin Regulation, as I pointed out. There's an EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is supposed to protect everyone. There are mechanisms of judicial review with the possibility for any judge, also immigration judges in any EU country, to refer questions to the EU Court of Justice, if need be, under an accelerated procedure. Has any of this worked this summer? Not at all. The Dublin rule is proving completely untenable. Asylum claims ought to be judged by each country under identical rules, the Geneva Convention, supplemented by quite detailed EU legislation. But we read and see that there are huge discrepancies in the acceptance of such claims. Germany and Sweden are the most receptive countries. One statistic I checked this morning was that last year Germany took on more than 30% of all asylum claims in the EU. I think France was 6%. The population of France is not so much smaller than that of Germany. And of course, the Hungarian Prime Minister considers that refugees are a German problem, implying that they are wholly unwelcome in his country. So as regards this nice apparatus of directives which should be implemented by member states and the rule of law in the European Union, this is what we've seen this summer. Now, what to do about all this? It's easy, and many populist politicians take this view, it's easy to adopt the regressive position of abandoning Schengen and reinstating border controls between EU countries. Only if you think this through, it's no solution at all in my view, even if one discounts the negative effects for everyone else moving around a borderless Europe. The fact is that even more refugees would get stuck in Italy, in Greece, in Hungary, which are the most affected borderline states. I think that would be even less sustainable than the present situation, where you have a crisis such as the one currently engulfing Europe and the numbers trying to reach specific European countries. We have if you were to reinstate these borders, you can see what would happen. We have one space in Europe where something like this is happening. It's at Calais in France, because the UK is not part of Schengen. So there is no border-free travel between the two countries, and we've seen the scenes there of the hundreds of people who are trying to get onto trains or ships to get to the United Kingdom. If you reinstated borders in Europe, you would see these scenes at so many other borders between Italy and France and Hungary and Slovakia and what have you. So that's definitely not a solution. The crisis proposals which are currently on the table and being implemented are mostly focused on refugee redistribution, greater EU solidarity, greater solidarity than under the Dublin regulation, which simply would have as its rule to send everyone back to the first state in which they entered. We see that that's not easy to achieve, again in light of the politically toxic nature of immigration. But it also, in my view, dances around the problem of who decides about refugee status. And to me, at this point, but that's a wild academic proposal, which I don't think has any good chances at present to get on the real negotiating tables, but it does seem to me that this is the kind of policy area which calls for a different kind of federalism from the one which the EU kind of normally has, which is the EU normally has what has been called a system of cooperative federalism, whereby the EU does not much more than adopt rules and legislation which member states need to implement and respect. And for example, the internal market works pretty well like that. There is a kind of other tendency as well, of course. There are more and more agencies created by the European Union. But European Union law generally doesn't work the way federal law works in this country, where you actually have federal agencies which on the ground implement federal law. I think this refugee crisis and the fact that people want to claim refugee status and that the EU wants one system in different EU countries can really only be resolved if there is an institutional response by creating a Europe-wide refugee agency which would decide on refugee claims. So to have a unified decision-making. And also an agency which possibly could operate under a well-designed status of independence and could perhaps depoliticize the treatment of asylum claims, because as was also pointed out by Matthias, there is great confusion about the difference between asylum on the one hand and irregular, illegal, and legal immigration on the other hand. And it's vitally important, I think, for refugees that the issue of asylum is depoliticized. So that's a radical proposal which has no immediate chances of success. Instead, the EU is trying to distribute some asylum seekers, and it's also trying to protect its external borders, much more than has been done in the past. To me, that is pure political window dressing. You know in this country how difficult it is to keep people from getting in. With the one big border you have with Central and Latin America. Imagine the geography of Europe and imagine that we would really be able to create a fortress Europe with strict border controls everywhere so that people cannot get in. I think that's complete fallacy. My third comment, the threat to the EU's ethos. Consider the following example of how the law can be part of a virtual world which is totally detached from the real one. One of the core principles governing the Schengen Free Movement Zone, and this Schengen Free Movement Zone is called by the EU the area of freedom, security, and justice. Say that to an asylum seeker at present in Europe. One of the core principles is the principle of mutual trust. It means that in matters such as asylum, all EU countries are full protectors of human rights and that their relations should be governed by this principle. They cannot check, when returning an asylum claimant to another EU member state, whether that claimant's rights will be respected. And the EU Court of Justice even went so far, less than a year ago, to declare that this principle of mutual trust is so important to the EU legal system that it needs to be protected even from interference by the European Court of Human Rights. This is in a different context of a possible accession of the EU to the European Convention on Human Rights. Fortunately, the European Court of Human Rights is a bit less presumptive about standards of human rights protection across Europe. So, mutual trust this summer, all EU countries offering refugees treatment which respect their human rights. Just think of all the images we have seen of trains going nowhere, of fences, of border crossing points with growing makeshift camps, and think also of all the political statements which have been made by all kinds of politicians in Europe. I think all of this shows that the refugee crisis is an existential one for the EU. Its claims to have values such as human rights, freedom, and the rule of law as its foundations are, of course, rather empty if it does not manage to deal with refugees in a more organized and humane manner. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Before we move on to Adam, I think it's important to clarify just one mechanical legal rule, which is important to understand the dynamics both with regard to what Pete described and the agreement between the EU and Turkey. So normally in refugee law, you have a right as a refugee to be recognized as such in the first safe country you're going to. If you travel, so say if you're a Syrian refugee and you travel to Turkey and things are safe in Turkey, then it means if you don't want to be in Turkey as a refugee, but you want to move on, you think you want to go to Sweden maybe, or to Germany, and then you kind of go through Greece and you travel your way up to Germany, then under existing law, Germany or Sweden could in principle say, you are a refugee, you were persecuted in Syria, but you've traveled through a whole bunch of safe countries, and we can send you back there if that country agrees to take you back. So the question now is, in those types of cases, will that other country take the refugee back? And Turkey, as you might imagine, with 2 million refugees already within its borders, is not keen to take on additional European refugees, those who've bought their life vests, etc., in Turkey and then made their way to Europe and are now to be sent back. So Turkey says no, except that now, this is the point of the agreement. This is one of the points of the agreement. Now Turkey says yes, okay, we'll do what we can to keep them all here and to take them back if they move on, if you give us the money to pay for the camps and the costs, etc. And similar, the Dublin, the infamous Dublin regulation, in many ways just insists that notwithstanding a more integrated Europe, within Europe still the same principle applies. That means if you're a refugee that first applies in Greece, that first comes to Greece, well, then it's the Greek state that's responsible for processing these refugees. And if the refugee then moves on from Greece to somewhere else, then it's the right of that other country to basically say, no, we're not going to process your application. We know that you came from Greece, and therefore we will send you back there. So the Dublin regulation in many ways just takes up the general principle contained in the Geneva Convention, that it's the first state that the refugee gets to that matters. Now, if you're a refugee in Syria, what does that mean? You have to think hard which country you're going to be in first, because it's going to be hard for you to move on from there. So what can you do? One option is, say you're well connected and you're reasonably financially well off, what you're going to do is get false papers and then buy a ticket, an airplane ticket, and fly into the country that you want to fly to. But that's tough, because it's difficult to get good forged papers that will get you through, and it's going to be expensive. So this is going to be 8,000 to 10,000 euros. That's apparently the current market price for this. So very few actually have that option open to them. The other option is to get across the Mediterranean directly, because then you can go to Italy and Greece directly. As we know, and as we know from the headlines and the many dead on the ships that didn't make it, this is a very dangerous option under the real-world conditions where how this is taking place. So But these are, you understand why there is an incentive to go for these either expensive, but you can't afford it, but then dangerous ways. Because if you go the land route, if you go through Turkey, it may be in the end the least dangerous path, but it's also the one that's least likely to succeed on legal grounds. It's because you go through so many safe countries that in the end you don't want to end up in, that it's the least attractive option for refugees. So one of the things we might discuss a little later on after we hear Adam is, what do we think of this rule, which basically allocates the burdens for accepting refugees according to not a system of solidarity and fair share, not globally certainly, and not even within the EU currently, but it's just this random question of where they first go to. Basically burdening in particular the neighbors of states that have a problem with the burden that refugees typically present. So that's a core rule. It's hardwired into the legal structure as we know it, and we might ask questions about that. Is that an appropriate rule, and how might an alternative regime look like? But first, let's think about comparatively how all of this plays out and is reflected and is connected to things in the US context. Adam.
Thanks, Matthias. And actually, I think I want to, in a way, follow up on your suggestion and take up this question about the one country rule, because it is a signal way in which the US refugee policy necessarily operates very differently from policy in the EU. So let me say three quick things in order to motivate that discussion for us, which I think is really important. So there are, a couple of historical reasons, so two historical reasons really, why the European context looks a lot different than refugee and asylum policy in the United States. And one of those, paints the United States in a kind of attractive light, and one in a not so attractive light. So the first is, as a historical matter, the United States has been a relatively open country to migration in general, and in the second half of the 20th century to at least moderate flows of refugees. The country annually takes in, outside of the refugee context, over 1 million green card holders, right? So that's nearly that's more than I think the recent EU agreements about refugees. So there are large migration flows into the US within the legal system. And then of course, in the shadow migration system, there have been flows that at times have been even higher than that rate. So you've got relatively high levels of in-migration, a country that, for all of its problems, has actually been surprisingly successful over the course of a couple hundred years at integrating very large flows of migrants into the political body. And so I think that affects the way refugee policy is operationalized in the US. The second historical fact, which is less attractive, is the US, as Pete alluded to, has historically used relatively aggressive enforcement policies to shape both migration flows and refugee policy. So on the one hand, in the last 3 decades or so, we've increasingly hardened the southern border, which has had dramatic consequences for the ability of refugees to actually enter the country to seek asylum. And on the other, the relatively rare occasions when the US has faced pretty large shocks of refugees, right? Similar in scope to what Europe faces now, have principally involved situations where people are coming in boats, right? So people coming from Cuba as part of the Mariel boat lift, people coming from Haiti on more than one occasion. Those episodes in US history did involve, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing their home states and seeking refuge in the US. But in those instances, the US very quickly adopted policies of at-sea interdiction and offshore processing, right? And that dramatically changed both the politics, because you didn't have, images of people in train stations, in Maryland or Virginia or Florida. Instead, you had pictures of people being picked up on Coast Guard vessels and held at Guantanamo Bay, right? Which, although many of us have forgotten this point of history, Guantanamo Bay, before it was the camp for post 9/11 detention, was actually first a large refugee camp that President Clinton put in place to process applicants for asylum who are interdicted coming from Haiti. Okay, so the structure of enforcement, the ability to interdict people at sea before they can reach land, that's been a very important part of the shape of American immigration policy. But the third thing, so there's two historical facts, but the third thing is a structural difference in the way American law is structured in relation to the international legal commitments. And that goes to this coordination question that Pete talked about and to the one country rule that Matthias raised. So as an initial matter, one thing we might ask is, why isn't it the case that refugee policy, unlike so many other issues that might divide Europe, why isn't it the one that stands out? Because it might be the one where we would think, if we just read the code books, where there isn't a coordination dilemma. Because rather than having to harmonize separate national laws, as Pete said, it should be the same law that applies in every receiving state, the legal standards provided by the international convention to which the individual member states are signatories. So we might think that international law could supply a solution to the coordination problem for the EU member states. So the puzzle for us as lawyers is to ask, well, why hasn't that worked, right? And I think there are three reasons, two of which have to do with law and one of which has to do more with people. So the formal legal reasons are, one, the first country rule, what Matthias said. So even though it is true that there's a uniform obligation to accept people who have a reasonable fear of persecution in their home country, that obligation only falls on the first country in which a person arrives when they're fleeing persecution. And so that creates a situation where the states that are located in a way that is most accessible for people fleeing their home states are likely to, not just as a practical matter, face greater burdens, but also as a legal matter, face more significant international obligations. So that both places formal obligations on places like Greece and Italy, and also gives a kind of legal stick to other countries in the EU who can say, as a matter of formal international commitments, like, we are not actually obligated to take these refugees off your hands. The second thing is that it's easy to focus too much on the uniformity of the substantive commitments embodied in the international agreement and overlook what we all know as lawyers, which is that what often matters more than substantive rules are procedures. And in practice, the reason why there's dramatic variation in the reception policies for refugees around the world, even among states that have signed up to the international commitments, is that their screening policies and procedures differ dramatically. And that produces very, very different success rates for prospective refugees in different countries. And of course, if you are a prospective refugee and you have any sense through your information networks about those different prospects for success, you want to go to the receiving states where you stand the best chance of actually making a valid claim for asylum. The third thing, which is less about the formal structure of the law, is that, of course, while refugee status and economic migrant status are formally distinct, people who are fleeing persecution would often prefer to go to countries where either they have familial or social or cultural networks, or to go to places where they're going to have a better chance at a new life. And that often means the states that are economically more well off will be the preferred destinations for people who are fleeing persecution. So that means you have sort of two sets of countries that might face burdens, right? The wealthy countries that are attractive to lots of refugees, places like Germany, and the border countries who are the first point of landing. Now, as Pete said, in the EU, the free movement policy complicates the way in which these burdens will be shared among nation states. The United States, of course, has its own free movement policy, right? So once you've entered the United States, it is actually a constitutional violation for a state to attempt to close its borders to people coming from another state. So you might think, we have a kind of similar problem. So how have we solved it? Well, one solution that Pete suggested is you can nationalize the policy. So that's what we've done. We've nationalized our immigration policy, and state efforts to develop different formal immigration policies are frequently suppressed, as we saw in the litigation between the United States and Arizona just a couple of years ago. But of course, the US experience here provides a lesson for the EU, which is that nationalizing the policy will not necessarily make the political tensions go away, because it still will be the case that places like Germany and Greece and Italy will inevitably face greater burdens of receiving large numbers of refugees. And if they're formally prohibited from developing their own immigration policies to try to mitigate those burdens, they will of course seek workarounds, which is what we see in the US. So if you can't keep people out as a matter of formal law, well, you make their lives more difficult where they live to try to encourage them not to stay. And so my prediction would be, like, if we see a nationalization, which might be the only available policy path here, it would probably be followed by a series of responses by the member states that would, in effect, attempt to encourage people to leave if they can't be forced. So I'll stop there so we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Anne. That's very good. So maybe what we should do is, and so we understand the problem in the European Union. To negotiate a national solution is difficult if states know, there are a number of states, they know they're not going to be burdened very much by the refugee issue within the context of the existing rules. So if you're in the Netherlands, you're not probably going to have a significant refugee issue problem. Conversely, if you're in Greece or in Italy, you know that simply in virtue of where you are, you're going to have a much more significant kind of problem. So if that's the if that's the default, then now the difficulty is to abstract from that and to come to some kind of a solution where some kind of solidarity will prevail, because actually it just means that certain countries in a zero-sum game will have to give up certain kinds of positions and will face certain burdens which before that they wouldn't have to face. So that's kind of the difficulty of invoking solidarity here. And it has to be said, Germany in this crisis kind of looks pretty good. Angela Merkel has come forward in a variety of ways and has gotten some very good press for it, and I think for good reasons. But we have to be aware Germany too wasn't particularly concerned about the refugee problem for so long as it was primarily on some Italian islands where these refugees were landing. It was only when Germany itself was kind of overwhelmed by refugees that it started really picking up the slack and started to think about the policy implications and invoking solidarity on a European scale. So are these problems solvable? Is there likely to be a solution? And even, Pete, taking up what Adam said, even if there was a nationalization of policy, isn't Adam right that in the European context in particular, there's likely to then be an incentive? Because of the open market, in the end, it will be clear that burdens will be disproportionately allocated so people will go to certain countries which they think are attractive, and in the end, it's going to cluster around a handful of countries anyway. So it won't even really solve the problem. And secondly, as a result, what we may see is, because those countries fear those burdens, is they're going to make life miserable for the refugees. They will grant them the status, but they will make life miserable in a way that ensures that at the first opportunity, those refugees then have an incentive to actually go back again to where they originally come from. The better you make their lives, the more you succeed in integrating them, the greater the probability they will stay. And so there is this problem of a disincentive to actually accommodate and be constructive with how you engage immigrants. So how is this going to be solved? Turku.
So we tend to use the word burden a lot when we talk about refugees, and I myself did so as well in my presentation. But I think we ought to also be emphasizing what kind of assets these these refugees are bringing to Europe in the long term. I know it's really crude to talk about human beings who are fleeing persecution in those terms, but bear with me a moment, because this language of material value added is the language that the EU feels most at home in. These are not just sort of additional mouths that member states have to feed. If member states adeptly integrate these families into their societies, they're going to become productive members of European societies, which, by the way, are in dire demographic need of a dynamic working population to pay for their generous pension systems and social welfare systems, given Europe's aging population. The European Commission, for example, has shown a very astute understanding of this, and in the past decades, it's pushed member states towards easing their very restrictive approach to the reception of migrants in general, trying to get them to see that they are going to need the injection of a dynamic labor force if they want to keep up their generous welfare states.
Yeah, I think a lot depends on how political discourses develop. And you're quite right to point out this problem, Adam, of one uniform nationalized policy does not preclude different behaviors by states. And we, in fact, already see that within the European Union context, which is not a refugee issue. One of the main claims of the United Kingdom in its nowhere to be seen renegotiation of its terms with the European Union, the reform of the European Union, which it seeks, is to insist that there are way too many European Union citizens coming to work in Britain because of the very generous benefit system in that particular country. It's also not that system would be so generous, is not so obvious either. But you see that kind of discourse, it's kind of a parallel to what might happen to the case of refugees. And we are certainly, I think, in a very crucial and uncertain time with respect to how all these discourses develop. It's quite clear that mostly on the right, extreme right, but also on the extreme left, there's a rejection of European policies, globalization, which is fed by a lot of fear of the immigrant. On the other hand, I think we've seen with this crisis, it's been so big, that there's been another type of discourse which has developed in Germany, also in other countries, to kind of show humanity and see that this is really not just an economic issue, because I'm not so sure that whether really the political discourses can be changed by simply saying we need these immigrants because they will contribute to our economy, but rather a discourse of greater humanity. It's on all our screens, and these are people who are in desperate need and who need to be helped. And so I really think that a lot will depend on to what extent we manage to have a continuing, genuine European political discourse about these issues, and one which also, devotes space to this idea that these people really do deserve help and should not be looked at as dangerous immigrants. But it's very uncertain, I think.
Great. Well, we have time to take a couple of questions, and I think the way that we'll do it is we'll bundle them. So we'll bundle 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll have one more round as a response, and then we will finish 5 minutes before 2 on time. That is, if there are questions. So now is the time for you to raise your hands, if there's something that you'd like to ask any of the panelists. Okay, one back there.
Can I speak?
Yes.
Okay, hello. I would just like to know if the US has any experience with quotas that we have basically seen in Europe now. Is that a good solution, a right solution? Is there any experience that Europe maybe could take into account? Thank you.
Okay. Up front here, yeah.
I have a question for Turco XXL. So I found very interesting your reading of the agreement between Turkey and the EU. And one parallel directly sprang to my mind. Do you think that the EU is trying to do all over again what it used to do with the Maghreb dictatorial states? The Maghreb dictatorial states, so Tunisia, Libya and Egypt, so externalizing the burden and the risk by creating some kind of an external border that stop the immigration flows.
Very good.
I have a question about the first country rule. What if the first country is not or does not provide a safe area for refugees? For example, the way Turkey was just described, it doesn't seem to me like a safe place for people to live.
Good, excellent. Okay, I think we'll have to leave it at that. So, Turku, do you want to begin?
Yeah, so a journalist asked me whether this agreement between the EU and Turkey was likely to renew Turkey's prospects or brighten Turkey's prospects of membership, and I said I thought quite the opposite, because in fact this may be a way of dialing down the cooperation into one of a sort of pragmatic partnership rather than the full relationships of reciprocity that come with membership, and in fact something that Chancellor Merkel has in the past said that she favors. So it's a kind of, it might in fact be the model for a kind of a privileged partnership between the EU and Turkey in the long term. So I think it's very much a give and take of sort of externalizing, as you put it, the EU's problems and Turkey getting a bunch of change and more forbearance in terms of its political shortcomings in return.
Great. Do you want to say something? Adam.
Yeah, so let me say just a word about the safe country question and also about the U.S. quota, because they're connected in a way. So as a matter, an important difference between the de facto policy in Germany, the de jure policy in the U.S., and the actual international commitment is that, as a matter of international law, the requirement is that people be protected from return to a place where they are at risk of persecution on one of the number of enumerated grounds. So it is not, it's not clearly a requirement of international law that people be provided with a good life. It certainly is not a requirement that people be provided with any path to integrate into the receiving state. And so the US policy, for example, on asylum is much more generous in a way than the international legal commitments require, because if you receive asylum in the United States, after being in the status of an asylee for 1 year, you can actually apply for a green card. And if you get that green card, 5 years later, you can apply for citizenship. So the status of being an asylee in the US actually provides a pretty clear path to not just de facto integration, but actually becoming a full citizen of the state. But those requirements are not really a part of international law, which really requires only that you be protected from return. So that goes to this point about US quotas. So the United States does formally have a quota for asylees, people who are formally granted refugee status in the United States. It's set each year by the president, actually. It's one of the few areas of domestic immigration law where Congress has formally delegated to the president the power to set an immigration-related quota. Now, it's set in consultation in some ways with congressional committees, but it is largely decided by the executive branch. The quota itself may not be hugely significant, though, other than symbolically, because in years where more folks arrive and are eligible for asylum than would in fact fit within the quota, their numbers are often applied to a future year, and the numbers for the subsequent year are adjusted. And even if that were not the case, the United States, while it has a quota for people who get the status of asylee and are put on this path to permanent residency, actually has another form of protection which just tracks the international legal commitment, which is the protection from being removed if you face a threat of persecution in your home state. And so even if the quota in the US was used up, if it was in the situation of, say, Germany, it would, under US domestic law, still have an obligation not to remove people, even though it wouldn't have to hand them the status of asylee and this path of permanent residency and citizenship.
Great. I think that was an important point, I think, that Adam made, and that that it's important to kind of really emphasize that when we're talking about the status of a refugee, it is something that refugees have a right to, and it's a human right. So there are no quotas that could ever be justified. Now, there are administrative, pragmatic ways of setting quotas nonetheless, but if they actually have the effect of keeping people out who would otherwise have a right to be in, well, that would be a violation of the rights of the respective persons. So also when there is talk, as there is in Europe, about the absorption capacity of societies in the context of the refugee crisis. Now, as a debate about paths to integration, paths to assimilation and citizenship, it's possible to have this kind of debate. There is a legal space for that to occur. But as a debate about who you accept as a refugee, that's simply a debate we needn't be having, we shouldn't be having. The only debates that are worthwhile to have in this context are debates about A, ensuring that the preconditions for refugees to be able to claim refugee status don't hold. So, fix problems, make sure that human rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled elsewhere, or at least don't do anything that brings about that situation. And in this case, of course, when we look at the refugees coming from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and also from Syria, many Western countries were involved in some way in helping bring about the process that gives rise to this problem in the first place. So fix the problem, that's one kind of direction. And the other is make arrangements with other states relating to the allocation of, and I will use the language now because in pragmatic political terms, unfortunately, that's what it is, make arrangements relating to the to allocation of burdens. And there is something that where the status quo does indeed lead to situations that certain countries are burdened very significantly, very severely, and others not at all. And in a purely random way, from a moral point of view, random way. So that's an important variable where in terms of future regulation, certainly in the context of the EU, but also more generally, globally. There are again and again attempts made to think about it and try to get something going. But of course if we do a political economy analysis about the incentives of the respective actors, we understand the difficulties of getting this done. Okay.
Can I say one word about that? Yeah, just as a closing thought, I mean, another way to characterize what Matthias has just said is the absence of any obligations on the part of the countries that aren't receiving large shares to coordinate in order to share the burdens of refugee policy. That could be seen as one of the greatest failures of the current structure of the international arrangements, because, as Matthias said, it's true. If every single refugee in the world wants to go to one destination state, and if they arrive in that destination state as their first state, the formal obligations say that country's on the hook for integrating that entire population, even if it, is larger than the population of the receiving state itself, and no other state at that point has any international obligation to help out in any way. And that creates that coordination problem, the fact that international law has nothing to say about that coordination problem, is a real shortcoming of the current system.
Yeah, and I mean, that coordination problem is, of course, caused by what I would call a black hole in the whole legal arrangement, international legal arrangement, which is that you have a right to asylum in any country where you arrive, but it doesn't spell out how you could arrive in that country. If you can go over land and by sea and end up at the shore, or cross a land border, you're in that country and you're entitled to have your claim being looked at. But if you want to board a plane with a regular passport, not with a forged one, and just arrive at a territory and say, I'm here to claim asylum, that doesn't work. So all countries should look into asylum claims, but they can't stop people from ever reaching their territory legally And that seems to me to be the black hole, you know, in a world of
But just
of
to
air travel.
But just to clarify, Pete, of course, if they actually manage to get on board a
If they
plane and
manage,
land, then they're in. So the difficulty will be that at the airport, they'll check whether you are eligible to enter the plane.
Yeah.
And that's where you need the
where-
forged papers. Yeah, that's right. So great. Thank you very much. I hope we've been able to provide some kind of background and context without providing any solutions, but at least I think we hopefully provided a deeper understanding why it's such a hard and intractable problem. So thank you very much.